Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Leo Polovets. He is a general partner at SUSE and Humba Ventures. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stuart. Excited to be here again and to chat again. Really enjoyed the last episode we did a few years ago.
Yeah, and so much has happened. I mean, and the key question that I want to get right directly in is that I have an imagination, and please, I want you to agree, disagree, or add nuance to it. That essentially, because of what's going on with AI and the changes to software, that many investors are thinking that it's not it's not in 5 to 10 years that the returns from software may be significantly different. So they may not be venture-backed things. And so people are moving into hard tech and deep tech because those are where the real problems still remain, and will continue to remain regardless of what happens in AI. Although AI might have a good, interesting add-on effect to those problems as well. Is that an accurate assumption?
Yeah, I think it's pretty accurate. I mean, it depends investor to investor. So there's definitely some folks I know where they're really embracing AI and basically feel like it's a great place to invest. Either they're not thinking about 5 or 10 years out, they're thinking about how fast companies can scale in just a few years, which has been really impressive. Or they are thinking 5 or 10 years out and they think these companies will be durable and last. And so I think there's definitely a contingent of investors like that. And then there's a contingent that's like, hey, the barriers to entry feel a lot lower. AI is getting more and more powerful. Like, increasingly, like you don't even need to be an engineer to write like pretty good software. And if that's not true today, it'll be true in a year or two. And so I think that's definitely a risk people see with it and with building software businesses. So that does create a shift towards things with like hardware and bio labs and, where like AI is like less present for now.
Hardware, biolabs. Let's go into the categories of those. It says hardware, biolabs. I'll add a few too, because there's solar panels in space. There are that beam energy down. There are space factories. There are I think there's material science, like new materials. I would love to go into that if you have any insight into the material science. There's one that you talked about on LinkedIn recently, which is the automation of fish laboratories, which would be fun to talk about as well. Any other broad categories of hard tech or deep tech?
I mean, I would say if I was to encapsulate the subject you said, like it's sort of a lot of stuff that involves the physical world, right? Like energy is another area, right? Like better sources of power. And there's a lot of interesting directions people are going in. Like there's geothermal, there's wave energy, there's tidal energy, there's, all kinds of stuff. So, but like basically anything that's not pure software and involves the physical world in some way, whether it's biology or chemistry or physics, I think those are all interesting areas where, AI will probably play some role, but you still need the physical component in some way.
And so what companies are you most excited about, particularly ones that are not obvious to people outside of this field?
Well, I would say the field is broad. uh, so, I would say I'm interested in, like, there's two types of investors. I think some are very thesis driven and thematic, right? Where they're kind of doing research. They decide like, okay, this is a category I like, or this is a specific business I want to see. Let me go talk to 20 companies doing this and try to pick the best one. And then there's the kind that are of investor that's more opportunistic, right? Which is like, I'll just go meet a bunch of companies, and if something seems interesting, I'll try to invest. I'm definitely more in that second camp. So I definitely feel like my interest sort of like ebbs and flows in different areas depending on what I'm seeing in the market for the companies, like maybe what the macro is like for, like, some sectors are better than others at any given time, or maybe harder to invest in than others. So for a while I was doing I was looking at a lot of defense companies. I'm still looking, but I haven't invested as much in the last 6, 7, 8 months because it's been like a frothier sector with all of the global conflict going on. So it's, I'm kind of excited about the impact, but it's been harder as an investor to underwrite some of the investments. On the flip side, I think robotics is really interesting. I feel like it's, kind of having its own ChatGPT moment, but a few years behind.
Yeah.
So maybe it's sort of where like ChatGPT 2 was or something like that, a few years ago, where you see a lot of potential. It needs more refinement, it needs more data, it needs more scale, but like, you could kind of see where it's going and it's really exciting. You mentioned space, like solar panels in space. I think space infrastructure is interesting, right? I think there's a lot of stuff that maybe 5 or 10 years ago was too early to build, but now all the stuff that we have on Earth, like power grids and transportation and security, like you're going to need that as more and more things go up into space. as we get Starship, and that brings even more things into space. Like I think those are two areas I'm especially excited about these days. But I'll kind of look at anything.
Yeah, I really like that differentiation because it feels more serendipitous, and serendipity feels like it's the nature of the universe, is that there are like events that lead us to things that could not have been foreseen. And I really like the way you put it of like, rather than thinking, which might be a good tactic or strategy to think about what you want to invest in and then go find out more. But I personally like the idea of just like going where it takes you, where the story
Yeah.
takes you, basically.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think part of it too is like your investing cadence probably matters a bit, right? So there's like Series A investors where maybe like they invest in healthcare, they do one investment a year. You can spend 6 months just like doing a bunch of research and deciding, okay, I really want to focus on like healthcare, HIPAA, regulation management, or whatever, and then go really deep on it. And you can have a thesis and find like the best company and decide if you want to invest. If you're doing like 5 or 10 investments a year, it's really hard to have 10 good new theses every year where like they're deep enough and sophisticated enough that you're getting like real insight, and that you can like find a company in each one. So like, maybe I have like 1 or 2 areas of interest where I'm like, oh, if I see a company here, like my ears perk up. But in general, just anything where the team is interesting or the idea is really interesting, like I tend to just want to learn more.
okay, this is really interesting territory. There's a question, hopefully I don't lose it, about the specific thing. Oh yes, it's about the how, like, the Warren Buffett statement that you got to really understand the things you're investing in, and if you don't understand it, don't invest in it. And then there's the sort of VC thing, which feels like you can make a lot of different bets, but in general, inside of a thing that's kind of what you know. But then there's like all these other interesting things, particularly as we've been talking about. There's so many different interesting things that seemed like they're going to be revolutionary and that have very different disciplines associated with them, particularly academic disciplines. Um, and how do you manage that tension? Do you believe? What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you invest as a way to learn about new things? And is that a good way to learn about new things?
I think it's a good but expensive way to learn about new things.
That's a way, yes. Yeah.
I I found that generally like there's a few ways I learn. So one is if I do get deep on some company, like I'll just try to learn whatever I can about the space quickly, like within a week or two. And you definitely don't become a world-class expert, but if you spend 5 hours reading about something or talking to a few experts or customers, like you can learn a lot. The other way I found that works is like, kind of go back to that serendipity point that you mentioned. I do believe in that, and like I try to just have like a nice large surface area of companies I look at. But over time, like there are themes that emerge where I'm like, oh, like I saw this company, maybe I thought the team was like, needed to add some more people, or maybe I thought the idea wasn't quite there, but like I like the sector. And so if I see other companies in the sector, like I'll talk to them too. And what happens is like the first time I talk to a company in a space, like I ask dumb questions. And the
Mm.
second time it's like they're a little less dumb because like I'm a little more prepared. And if I meet like the seventh company, 2 years
Yeah,
later, like
yeah.
now I'm like, again, still far from an expert, but I feel like I've kind of absorbed a bit. So that's probably how I learn about all these new spaces.
That's
To your point, like I think you have to understand it enough to like make an educated guess. Like, can this be a big company and a big like impactful thing? But you
yeah,
can't have certainty at like pre-seed and seed. Like it just doesn't
yeah,
exist.
yeah. It's so interesting because uh, the AI is changing the way that I study. And if I first got into spaced repetition memorization back when I started to program in 2015, or when I tried to learn that program, and I hated it. And I hated it for the very reason that I'm now doing it again, which is that I could never find the answers I was looking for, and I would have to go through Stack Overflow, and there's just so much to learn, particularly in the DevOps, before you can even do anything important. And then now with AI, that problem has gone away, totally gone away. Now, if I can't find the answer with AI, then I can ask human beings, and then it's fun because then it builds a relationship with the human beings as well. And so there's like this it's the whole thing has changed. And now there's a new thing coming in, which is investment, like investing as a way to learn. As you said, very expensive way to do it. But then there's the business. Then there's business as an activity, and business as an activity. You can learn about that too. Um, And I don't have any good questions here right now, but like
I probably don't have any good answers, so that's
good
fine.
answers too. Yeah. Because you were an engineer. You started as an engineer, right?
Yep. Yeah, I was a software engineer for about a decade.
When do you make the transition into business? I guess you were always
Uh,
doing business as an engineer, but what do you think? I guess what is the relationship between business and engineering?
yeah, I mean, I'd say like I definitely apply an engineering mindset to business. Like I try to understand things, I try to optimize things. I probably think more like an engineer in terms of like processes and risk mitigation and stuff like that. Um, the transition happened where I was an early employee at a couple of startups. So I was a one that a lot of people probably everyone's heard of, which is LinkedIn. So I was there when it was a dozen people for a couple of years.
Wow.
And there I was just engineering, and so I kind of like saw people doing other things, but like I was just coding. And then I worked at Google, and then I went to another startup called Factual, and there I was still, I'd say like kind of quote unquote just an engineer, but like touch product a little bit, touch design a little bit. I was trying to think about like how do we recruit, like what are some other products we can build, like what do customers want, and I like that more holistic aspect. And after spending 4 years at Factual, which is also kind of Series A stage when I joined like LinkedIn, I felt like I wanted to start a company, but I also felt like I kept seeing this 15, 30, 50 person stage, and I'd never seen what it was like when it was 2 people or 4 people and you're just starting out. And I think there's a bunch of founders, like honestly most of the good ones, where like they'll just dive in and figure it out, and they're pretty good at that, and they're kind of fearless about it. And then there's a smaller subset that are more methodical, and they're like, I want to prepare as much as I can. um, Maybe as an aside, I think Reid Hoffman at LinkedIn like had this famous interview from like 25 years ago. I remember reading, and kind of inspired me because I thought the same way. Where essentially, the interviewer was like, "How'd you decide to start, LinkedIn or SocialNet or whatever startup they're asking him about?" And he basically said, "Well, like I thought about what are the skills I need to be a founder, and it was like sales, product, like fundraising, blah blah blah." And he had like 4 or 5. He's like, "So I went, to Apple to learn design, to Fujitsu to learn sales, to the startup company to learn product, and then I felt like I was ready." And I'm probably like more in that camp, although not nearly as good as Reid.
Yeah.
And so basically, like I felt like I had some experience as an engineer early-ish, but not super, super, super early. And I wanted to start a company. I had some ideas, but I didn't really know that much about how business worked. And what happened was like kind of serendipitously, I met, maybe that's the theme of the show.
Yeah.
I met a few friends that were angel investors. They were looking for a technical person to help with tech due diligence. They were thinking maybe starting a fund around that. And I thought like, oh, this will be great. I'll do this for a year. I'll learn a lot. I'll meet a lot of founders. I'll learn from them. Like hopefully I can help them out in some way. And then in a year, I'll go start a company. And that was like 11 years ago. So I ended up just really liking investing. And so we angel invested for a bit. We started a fund around it called SUSA. That's more of a generalist traditional software fund at seed stage. And then being an engineer, I've always liked the deep tech stuff. So I started a sister fund called Humba Ventures about 2.5 years ago, and I've been focused on that for the last 2.5 years.
2.5 years ago, and this is why I'm really interested in interviewing you, is because you maybe just through serendipity, but also maybe there's some intention there as well. I only got into the deep tech thing about a year ago. One of my guests started talking about it, and I was just like, oh, this is really interesting. So like the real problems are being solved again, like and they're and then now it's sort of in that hype phase. And so can you talk more about the evolution from 2.5 years ago until today, and like what really made you think, okay, there's an investment fund that needs to be here for that right now?
Yeah, I would say actually I don't know if I've talked about this publicly, but Humba actually started as like an experimental fund.
Hmm.
And the origin of it was like SUSA Ventures started as a generalist firm, or kind of we had a couple of like filters for what we looked for in companies, but we'd invest across sectors. And then in the first couple of years, we had a lot of our big winners. So like our eventual big winners. So we invested in Robinhood at seed, we invested in Flexport at seed. Those were like fintech and logistics. We had some good SaaS investments, healthcare investments. And so when you fast forward 10 years, went from like a generalist fund that'll invest in anything to kind of a generalist fund, but really like there's 4 or 5 categories you focus on. And so it's like SaaS, fintech, healthcare, logistics, and dev tools. And those are like the 5 where 95% of our investments sit. And one thing I was thinking about is like, well, these are great, and this is kind of when some of the generative AI stuff was coming, but also just like a general thought, like, well, how do we add like a 6th and 7th category? And the more established you are in the categories you're in, the harder it is to like add something new, right? Because it's easy to just be like, well, it's not fintech, like what is this, like deep tech thing, or this defense thing? Like the bar for it is just so much higher because it's outside of your comfort zone. And so we started Humba as like a smaller pilot fund. It was basically like a tenth of the size of SUSE initially. And the idea was like to just invest smaller checks in categories that SUSE hasn't traditionally invested in. And the idea is like, well, to your point, like maybe you could learn through investing while also building a good portfolio, but maybe that'll give you the ammo to build like a sixth and seventh category at SUSE over time. And then, so I did that. And I think like 3, 4, 5 months in, just started seeing this pattern of like, well, I was looking at lots of areas like, education, consumer, social, and like all these things that like we hadn't done that much at SUSE. And they were all interesting, but the ones I was really drawn to basically ended up being deep tech, which is anything with like pretty high science or engineering risk.
Yeah. Okay.
And then American dynamism, which I bet some of your audience are that term, which is basically like, sectors that are like interesting to the US as a country, even though they're private sectors. So it's like, defense, a lot of defense is private, energy, manufacturing. These are like nationally important, but they're usually private. And those two areas really stuck out to me because, again, being part of the physical world made them more challenging, but also like there's a bigger barrier to entry. So if you take off, like you can really run away with the ball. I think there's a lot more like big outcome potential because these problems, like the solutions are often decades or centuries old. And so if you come up with something innovative that uses software or AI or whatever, like you create a ton of value. And then also, frankly, like I felt also a lot less competitive as an investor because a lot of investors will invest in AI or B2B SaaS. Not that many will invest in like defense robotics or something. And I just found it really fun and interesting as an engineer. So kind of quickly evolved from like an experimentation fund to like all in on deep tech and American dynamism.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Um, I really like what you did in terms of the categorization, and that's where the engineering comes in. It's like there's a business to investing as well, and there's things you can learn about investing, and there's ways that you can think about it that like the knowledge, and this kind of gets into the AI stuff as well, and leads to the next question is so AI is this weird background technology that nobody really understood unless they were working in it until ChatGPT came around. And then for some reason, like about 200 million people in the world got immediately into it and loved it. And then the rest of the world is like scared of it or like not really sure what it does, doesn't know how to think about it in a way that makes it useful. And because it's this different thing that isn't quite like automation, traditional automation. And so but it has a huge effect on any type of knowledge work. Like any type of knowledge work seems like, in my opinion, is going to get revolutionized by AI. And one part of knowledge work is understanding the physical world, understanding chemistry, understanding biology, understanding physics, understanding mathematics. And so how do you have you seen any kind of initial forays into this? How are you seeing that AI will change the physical world? Or at least make it easier to solve problems in the physical world. And then as a backup question that we can come back to is sort of how does technology move from the universities and academia and theory into practical applications? I just had a great lunch with a friend who's a German guy who is very much into that world of physical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and he loves that. And it got me my mind thinking. But let's start with the how will AI change the physical world?
It's a good question. I think it probably depends sector by sector. Like, I don't know if there's a one size fits all solution. I would say a few broad categories I've seen is one is just speeding up some of the processes around the physical world, right? So, like, for example, you want to go build a large power plant, and then there's like millions of pages of regulations you have to deal with. And you go spend 3 years and a team of 10 people like analyzing those regulations to figure out what you have to do. But like, what if AI could shrink that to 2 years or 1 year, right? Or 6 months? And so that's like, that's like a big unlock for energy projects, even though you're not touching hardware, but like you're helping facilitate something. I think design's another area. So I think in hardware, I forget the term, I think it's called generative design, where you get these like mesh surfaces. And it's like, well, you used to have this like brick or solid surface. And it turns out if you make it a mesh, it's like you need less material and maybe it has nicer properties, like it's lighter, it's more flexible or whatever. And so that's been around for like 5 or 10 years. There's companies like Entopology working on it. But I think you see that across a lot of, hardware, robotics, now like material science, protein design, like all of these things where you have AI that helps you make better and better, maybe preliminary design decisions. And then I think where the physical part comes in is a lot of times like you have to marry that design to an actual like feedback loop, right? Which is like, hey, our bio model said this protein is like going to work, but then you have to actually like make it and test it to see if it works, and then whether it does or not like feeds back into the model. And then same thing on like material science or hardware design or other stuff. Like, these things can't just work in theory; they have to work in practice. And then seeing if it works in practice helps you make better models.
Brilliant. Okay, very interesting. Do you know any companies that are doing protein design with generative AI?
There's a ton of interesting companies in this space. To be honest, I would say like I personally am not super deep in it. But I've looked at a little bit. There's actually like one company that I work with called Diffuse Bio that's building in this space. They went through YC about a year and a half ago. But there's a number of companies here. I would say in general, like 5-10 years ago, there were a lot of like deep learning for protein design or like machine learning for protein design. And then more recently it's evolved into like, use kind of the transformer models for protein design to see if that's better.
That is really interesting. Okay. I would love to follow up about Diffuse Bio, see if they'd be interested in doing an interview. The So hardware robotics. Oh yeah, let's go back to that question of how it goes from universities into like R&D, and then R&D into business applications. What is that life cycle like? And I guess without giving away any proprietary information or anything like that, how do you kind of like figure this out in your business?
There's actually like a few different pathways, and university like research spin out is definitely a big one. It's not one I've actually invested in too much in.
Hmm.
This happens a lot for things like biology, material science, things where like it's kind of maybe more around the science than engineering. And then a lot of the companies I invested in have been more like engineering innovation, and so that's more of like a SpaceX or something. And those typically come out of SpaceX, Tesla, like
Yeah.
Palantir,
Yeah.
kind of
Interesting.
like the most recent generation of winners in these spaces. And so you have like somebody that's like, oh, I built some fancy advanced manufacturing thing at SpaceX. I want to democratize this for the world, or I want to use that technology in some other area. I think that's like a pretty good recipe, but those are basically like industrial spinouts versus academic ones.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great. There's like, if we do a flow chart, there's two things at the beginning of the flow chart. There's academia, which has like theory, which is like, oh, the mathematics on this work out. And then there's industries that have done something before. And then both of those feed into that, well, what's the next step? It's, I guess, a startup. Yeah. A startup. And then the startup goes and tries to test it out, basically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah, and the test might be different. Like, for example, if you're at a university and it's something science related, you might already have research that kind of validates what you're doing, but maybe at a small scale because like your budget was small or like your team was small. And so a lot of times the early rounds are like, hey, this worked in like a petri dish. Will it work in, like in a vat that's like a gallon or 1,000 gallons? And like, so in the early days, you're trying to see like, hey, I made something like small and it seems interesting. Can it scale up? On the industrial side, it might be more of like applying something from one industry to another, right? Like, oh, I did something at SpaceX involving this kind of rocket, and I realized this technology could be used for like, energy grids or whatever. And then it's like kind of testing like, well, does this thing that I already know well but hasn't been used in this new industry, can I apply it to some other industry?
That's an interesting point. It really gets me into the period that I've been going a bunch on the show recently, is the solar punk versus the cyberpunk distinction, which for my listeners who haven't heard me hear that say that term, the cyberpunk is a novel, tons of novels, tons of great novels, but all very dystopian about what happens if technology solves our functional problem, or doesn't solve our functional problems. It just creates new functional problems, and also just like doesn't even touch our existential problems. And then solar punk there's one book in the genre. If you know of any other solar punk books in the genre, please let me know, because that one was a weird one from the 1970s. Very, very strange book. And there's only one, and it's like a Burning Man aesthetic. But essentially, it's like kind of utopian. It kind of is utopian, but that's not the way that I want to mean utopian, because I don't think utopia is a realistic goal. But like technology can solve so many of our functional problems without creating new ones, as long as we have some wisdom as to how it applies. What's your take on this? What's your take on the future, and like where are we headed? What are some things that we should like watch out for in this future so that we get the more solar punk, less cyberpunk?
Yeah, I mean, this probably gets more into politics than I should talk about
Yeah, yeah,
publicly, but
yeah.
I think a lot of those, like the positive versus negative to me is like
Mm,
how much like centralized power is there. Because I think it tends to get more dystopian when there's like somebody in control, when they're unimpeachable, maybe when they transfer power to somebody else that like is not a good leader. You see it at the government side, sometimes you see it at like the corporate side, right? Like you had a great CEO and then like a shitty CEO takes over and like takes a company. So I think those kinds of things are like maybe more dystopian.
yeah.
In general, I think technology broadly like takes us in a positive direction, and like there's exceptions, and any like I think people say this, like anything can be abused, but in general, like all these things I'm looking at on the Humba side is like, there are things like, hey, generate power more affordably, generate renewable power, like make things in space, like research new cancer like remedies. It's
Yeah.
hard to think of negative applications for those things,
Yeah.
right? They're generally like positives, and the more of them we have, like the more it advances the human race.
Mhm. Okay, that's yeah, brilliant. So the power side, it really kind of reiterating the fact that the power thing, that's the thing that ties it all together. Because that's the thing that in the 1960s started to be put into question about
Yeah.
like how much power are we going to have? And nuclear power lost that particular battle. It feels like it's coming back. This would be a good question.
Mhm.
Is nuclear power coming back? And if so, what are the interesting things that you've learned about nuclear power recently?
I can get to nuclear power in a second, but
Yeah, sure.
like I was thinking as an analogy, right? Like let's say like on the defense side, maybe you have like, like Israel's was Iron Dome, like seems really effective. And so I think technology like that is great in the sense that if every country had it and every city had it, that's great. Like it probably
Oh,
reduces a lot of harm, but also if everyone has it, maybe it like prevents people from like trying to launch missiles or something. But if like someone's in charge of that technology and they're like, I'm just going to sell it to like Republican states or Democrat states or like people over 60, like that's the kind of stuff where you get these disbalances, and then that creates a lot of like issues and potential harm down the road,
ooh,
right?
interesting. And that's like in the global, and because there's a global system, it's just an anarchic system that was like somewhat centralized over the past 60 years, but is no longer at all centralized. Basically, it doesn't feel like there's any centralization in the global anarchic system. And that's an interesting avenue for further things. But before going into that, I'm going to go think on that for a bit.
You could see it in like supply chains, for example. Like we have a lot of tension with China, but they
Yeah.
control a lot of like really rare materials that we need for like batteries and chips and stuff. And so it's like, well, like if they're the only ones that have it and we have a fight with them, like are we just like we're not going to have computers for the next 20 years?
Yeah,
Like
that's
those are the kinds of
yeah.
things that are like I think they create a lot of tension and unease and maybe conflict, right? Because like you start having things where you're like, or like what was it, like the Russian like natural gas pipeline to Europe
Yep,
or whatever.
yep.
Like you have these like single points of failure, and if like one entity or person controls them, that's a risky thing, and I think that's like a destabilizing thing.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting point. Single points of failure. And with the computer side, it feels like the computer side, and maybe it's the battery side as well. Those because it's not only the rare earth metals, and very interesting down here in Argentina. That Argentina has a huge amount of lithium, and the lithium is for batteries, and it's completely undeveloped right now. There's no one, I believe, no one developing the lithium mines, and that might change. And so, but that's for batteries, and then there's rare earth, and then there's just the computer supply chain to making semiconductors, which seems like there's going to be no change to that. Like even with the United States Chips Act, there's going to be no change to the fact that all of it's created in Taiwan. And then China itself is also starting to develop not state of the art chips, but they're starting to develop really good chips in China, not really good chips, good chips in China that kind of give them national security. And the United States may compete with that, but it doesn't feel like the United States is going to compete with state of the art chips. What do you think on that? We could actually go into robotics from that point too as well, because robotics seems to be very interesting for that world as well.
Yeah, that does seem like the case to me as well. To be honest, I haven't followed this area super deeply, but I think I read some headline recently that the U.S. was trying to get like the was it TSMC to like build like a factory in
Yep.
the US. I
Yep.
don't know how that's going. Like, so that would be interesting, right? Where at least like it kind of reduces like the dependence and it improves the resilience a little bit.
Mm.
But I do think that's like a big risk.
Mm. Yeah. And yeah, on the TSCM, me and my father have started a podcast, and our first guest in the idea of the podcast is to go back to the early days of the early personal computing industry and interview some of the luminaries during that time, who are all now in their 70s and 80s, and kind of get the crazy anecdotes out. And so our first guest was Donna Dubinsky, who is one of the was at Apple very early. And my dad and her had a really funny relationship with a lot of great anecdotes. But then she is helping with the CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act is really interesting in Arizona. They're trying to set up that new factory, but there's sort of like a lot of problems with getting it off the ground because it's actually the same problems that the chip industry faced in the very beginning, which is that the consolidated labor practices in the United States made it more expensive to do it here. So that's why it all ended up in Taiwan. I said here, I'm actually in Argentina now, which is, but my mind is still stuck there, basically, I guess. But
and by the way, maybe like unions are another example of like single point of failure, right? Because it's like one organization really controls something, in this case, like labor for an industry. And then, sometimes they make good rules and sometimes they make bad rules, right? And so I think that's like those kinds of things are risks.
Okay. Let's go into robotics for the next sort of 15 minutes. If you don't have 15 minutes, let me know. The essentially robotics is really interesting. It feels like there's some hype out there, and it also feels like there's some real stuff, and the relationship between LLMs and whatever other AI algorithms come out soon and physical robots is going to be really interesting because it already feels like science fiction in terms of me talking to the bots. But the bots aren't embodied inside a robot body. But as soon as they're embodied in the robot body, that makes all of the 1960s science fiction basically real. Not all of it, but a lot of it. What's your take on robotics? Like, what are the things that outsiders don't really understand about it?
Um, I'm not sure what outsiders do and don't understand about it, but I will say, like, I think it's moved very quickly in the last few years. Um, the biggest thing I've seen is I think robots are much more capable of learning quickly. Like if your audience wants to Google, there's a demo like by the Stanford Aloha group. I forget what Aloha stands for, but it's like Stanford Aloha demo. If you search for that, there's like a 5 or 6 minute video out there, and it's just a robot like folding clothes and cooking an egg and doing all kinds of stuff, but where you just give it like a little bit of an example and then it can do it. And like it's not perfect. Again, it's maybe more like ChatGPT 2 or 3 than ChatGPT 4, but you can see like that's like a pretty awesome thing that 5 or 10 years ago, as far as I know, was like basically impossible. So I think that's probably like the most exciting development. Like I think in my mind, I kind of view robotics on two axes. Like one is efficiency and one is learning. And I think a lot of the stuff we have in factories is more around efficiency, right? Because you're not trying to build, like a robot arm that could do 1,000 things in a factory. Like the robot arm itself can do 1,000 things, but like you program it to do like one thing really, really quickly.
Yeah.
Right. Like pick up this box and move it here or something, or like put this label on. And so it's less about like, hey, you're a robot arm, like here's 1,000 different projects going down the conveyor belt, figure it out. It's like do this one job really quickly. The flip side that I think wasn't really possible until a few years ago is the learning side, which is like you're in somebody's house and they have like dishes and laundry and they have to like open this package and like their baby's like stuck behind a table or whatever, and each task can sort of be like a one-off, or like maybe you've just seen it once or twice before. And so the idea is like how quickly can you pick things up and be useful, without like 1,000 examples, or like somebody in the family like sitting there programming for 5 hours to make sure you could like clean up the the Lego blocks or something. And so I think that's where there's a lot more activity and innovation right now, and I think it's a pretty exciting area.
Okay, I love that, and that's a new framework. So efficiency and learning, and that goes back to the question of how AI is going to change the physical world as well, because I actually was talking with a robotics person who moved down here from Berkeley, and he mentioned he doesn't use ChatGPT at all because it just doesn't do anything in his field, which is robotics. And that statement basically made me very interested in it. But then once you bring the computer vision into it, and you have computer vision, and you have the ability to learn based on that computer vision, do you know of any other like the LLM type things that are coming down the pipeline in terms of that learning piece? The Jan LeCun has talks about a world model. I'm not sure how whether there's been any progress, but anything in that realm that you know about at all?
Yeah, I would say just like generally ChatGPT and Anthropic, those are like foundation models for text. So I think a lot of people are trying to
Yeah.
build those in different ways for the world.
Yeah.
Right. Which is like recognizing things, recognizing actions. I think ideally like you get into a real world environment where you can learn, but the sense I get is you could also pick up a lot from like YouTube videos and stuff. Right? Like
Oh, interesting.
if you see enough YouTube videos of like here's somebody folding clothes, like maybe you could learn to fold clothes. I don't know. But I think there's a lot of effort to basically like build these kind of foundational models for interacting with the world and understanding the world.
Uh,
Um, and again, I think they're on the early side, but there's like exciting stuff there.
uh-huh. Cool. So let's talk about the company. There was one company we talked about in terms of the fish automation, and that was something that I hadn't heard of really before. I don't have it handy. No, I found it. Okay, so we were talking about um, uh, Shinke. So fish and automation, Shinke. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so trying to remember what is stealth and what's not.
Oh,
So generally they make fish processing robots, and what that means is like you catch a fish for like for food, and then you have to like process it in different ways, right?
mm,
It's a little bit like maybe morbid, but like you kill it, like you maybe like take off the parts that you don't want, like you have to preserve it in some way, you have to like check out for parasites. So generally that stuff is done by human beings, and so there's like an automation play there. But I think the interesting thing to me is what the founder Safe saw was like basically the way we catch fish today is for harvest is pretty inhumane most of the time,
mm,
in the sense that like somebody like a fisherman will catch them in a net and like just kind of throw them on the deck and then they suffocate. And it's pretty different than what we do with livestock. And
uh,
so and
oh,
what's interesting is like we're like in life with livestock, it's like a much more humane, like kind of automated process,
yeah.
right? Where so on the fishing side, what's interesting is in Japan there's this technique, I'm gonna mispronounce it, I think it's called like ikejime or something, but it's basically like a way of killing fish in the same way that you do with livestock, where it's like you find the brain, you put a spike through the brain, it's
Well,
instant, the fish doesn't stress out.
oh,
So it's more
interesting.
humane. But the really interesting thing is if you just like throw the fish on the deck of your boat and let it suffocate, it releases a bunch of stress hormones.
Oh,
So it's and then that actually like impacts the quality of the meat. So the
yeah.
meat is lower quality, it lasts less long. And so this more humane technique is actually also better in terms of
Yeah.
output, creates less waste, all of that. But it's kind of a hard problem actually, because you have different fish species, different fish sizes. The brains are not very large. So like, where do you actually like how do you kill the fish where you're like, hit it in the brain and not like some other place? And so I think that's where some of the automation secret sauce lies.
Brilliant. Okay, that's such an interesting insight. And it reminds me of the holistic nature of business and investing and technology is that like these things don't seem connected, but then there are many times where they are connected, and there's various things that we do as humans that affect the ecosystem in ways that we don't understand, technology being a giant one. But then, going back to that solar punk thing, we can bring technology back into it in some ways to improve it, and in some ways we need something else besides technology to improve it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Honestly, like I'm obviously biased because I'm an investor, but like
yeah,
I think this stuff is so cool because it's like, well, it's a better output for the world, right? You get less fish waste, the meat's better, it lasts longer, you could transport it, longer without it going bad. But also like it's better for the fish. So like what a like nice win-win, right?
yeah, yeah.
And I've actually found that to be true with a lot of robotics companies, where it's not really like a labor savings play, which I think is what most people fear. A lot of times it's actually something else, like, well, you can't hire enough people for this because it's like it's seasonal, or you can hire people but the job's dangerous, or like it's hard to train people to do this, or stuff like that. And I think that's where like robots really shine these days.
Yeah. And it also makes me think that investing, and to a certain extent journalism, what I'm doing with the podcast as well, is that uh, about investigating. You got to investigate things and learn about them, and in a sense, devote yourself to them, so
Yeah.
that you can make better decisions that are win-win. And yeah, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, and maybe also like tying it back to like the serendipity, like, are you opportunistic or thesis driven for investors? Like, I had no thesis on like, how to kill fish better, right? Like, I hadn't thought about it. Like, I actually didn't even know how they were processed in the first place. And then I met this like really interesting founder, Safe, and like, he was obsessed with the industry and how things were done and how things could be done, and like it was contagious, and I learned a lot myself, and so it was just like a fun rabbit hole to go down. But like not something where I had been reading about fisheries for a year and decided like this is the specific place I really want to like make my next investment.
Yeah, interesting. That brings to mind the question that I've been investigating a bit as well, which is the necessity of being in San Francisco or the Bay Area, or with deep tech and hard tech. There's another add-on, which is El Segundo in Los Angeles. And I mean, if you have any other places that are kind of hot spots for deep tech or hard tech for actually physically being located. But the real question, I would love to hear it, but the real question is like, is San Francisco the best move in terms of career? Obviously depends on a lot of different things, like what stage the career is, how large a network is. But if you're starting a hard tech company, how big of an advantage is it to be in the Bay Area or in El Segundo?
I think it's moderate. I think it depends on what you're doing too. Um, I, and I would say like I think it's different for founders and companies and investors. And I'm kind of biased, but like I'm in Miami these days.
Oh,
Like
interesting.
Miami's not the hard tech capital of the world.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
honestly, I found that like a lot of the companies I invest in are just like all over the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
like
Any
like for
any
example,
outside of the
uh,
US?
U.S. and Canada, but not really outside of those areas.
Okay. Yep.
Um, I, not because there aren't good companies in Europe and other places, but just like it's less in my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Um, but like I'll pick defense. Like I think I have 5 investments in defense over the last few years. There's one in Atlanta, one's in New York. One started in New York and moved in LA. Like one's in SF. One started in SF and moved to LA. So like there's definitely like a little bit of an SF LA field, but also like it's all over the place. There's another company that does software for government. They're in DC. So it's just like there's no way I'm gonna be in the city where every company has started. And if I'm in SF, maybe like 80% of the companies are not where I live. And I'm in Miami, maybe it's like 95%. But kind of directionally, it's pretty similar. You know,
Are you going to events in Miami? What is, because in 2020 it blew up, Miami blew up. So many people moved there. And now since then, I imagine there's been a little bit of a fall. What's the latest there now? What's it like there now?
I think it's a good scene. I would say like I think it's great for meeting investors, and then decent for meeting founders, and then not that great yet for building an in-person company.
Yeah,
Which is
interesting.
not to say that there aren't good companies built in person here. It's just there's not that many of them, and there's not quite as many engineers here as you'd want for like compared to like an SF or LA or New York.
That's a very good point. So it's basically where you want to go if you have a remote company or are building a remote company. So it's Miami is the
Yeah,
capital of remote companies. Maybe competing with New
yeah,
York.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's good for remote companies. I would say like there's pockets it's good for. Like it's been great for crypto.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Crypto's had its ups and downs, right? But
Yeah.
like it's close to the Caribbean. A bunch of like I think a bunch of crypto companies are domiciled in like the Virgin Islands or Bahamas or whatever.
Yeah.
It's great for anything with like Latin America because I think it's a
Mhm.
good like U.S. office for a Latin American company,
Yeah.
either as a headquarters as like a second office. So there's
Ooh.
a bit more like consumer, LATAM, fintech, crypto here. Not like I've definitely seen interesting hard tech companies here, but not that many.
This is a great point that you mentioned. And it's funny that I'm in Latin America at the moment. I love Latin America. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of different countries in Latin America. Sao Paulo is generally considered the hub of it, but Buenos Aires is definitely not the hub. But it's it actually like it started off the whole thing in Latin America with Mercado Libre. Mercado Libre is from Buenos Aires. They're now in Uruguay. Um, and so Sao Paulo is a giant. Colombia's got some stuff going on. It Peru, not too much that I've heard of, but I'm sure there's stuff there. And Mexico, of course. But then Miami as the capital of the startup scene for Latin America is very interesting. It makes me think about ideas for connecting, because I one of my favorite things about being down in Argentina is that I can kind of help as a bridge between here and Silicon Valley. But Miami is already the bridge between the United States and Latin America, not necessarily there, but that connection is really interesting. I'm going to go investigate that more. Do you know anything about that? Like, can we dig further into the Latin America, Miami as the capital of Latin American startups?
To be honest, don't know much about it because
Yeah.
I haven't been investing there. Like because I'm focused more on the deep tech side. So it's just more something I've observed that like a lot of like startups that sometimes my teammates will talk to on the SUSE side that deal with Latin America. The founders are maybe they live in Miami, maybe they split time with Miami, but like a lot of times Miami is like part of the equation.
Yep. Interesting. Cool. Well, a couple minutes left. What are you most excited about now? Well, anything that our listeners should know about that you're working on that you want to share with everybody? Like anything that you're really excited about in that front?
Well, like I said, I'm kind of more serendipitous and opportunistic. So I just,
Mhm.
like chatting with interesting founders, working on interesting things. One project that I'm building with a couple of friends, uh, where I'd say I'm probably like 3% of it. My friend Julian Shapiro at Julian Capital runs it, and then me and a couple of folks from Undeterred Capital and also Capital help out a little bit. But it's a project called Deep Checks. So it's deepchecks.vc. It's a place where founders in this space can like submit their deck or pitch and get like a few dozen great like angels and VCs on the deep tech side to check it out. And it's only been around for a couple months, but like there's investments being made. Actually made an investment from the deep checks community a couple weeks ago. It was my first one. There's like investments being made, like a bunch of conversations, the pitches happening. So I think it's a great place to pitch like a deep tech company if you're building in this space.
Brilliant. Okay. I love that idea. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, awesome. Really fun chat, and thanks for writing me, Ken.